Let's turn to Canada first and British Columbia's evolution to a framework approach. I would ask our first witness, Mr. Neil Hasty, who's the president and CEO of Incor Pacific Inc. Mr. Hasty, thank you for coming. And please have a seat and begin your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee. It's a pleasure for me to be here to share some of the experiences that we've had in British Columbia. Typically, Canada exports a number of different commodities to the United States, primarily cold fronts, hockey players, and bacon. So if we can export some of the learnings that we've had in British Columbia, then we'd be pleased to do that to benefit the great state of California. California and BC have very much in common. We are people joined to the ocean and contained by our mountains. Our desire to protect the natural environment influences the way we think and the way we govern. These shared values are being expressed in tangible ways through the Pacific Coast Collaborative that brings together the governments of California, Oregon, Washington, and the province of British Columbia. At their meeting in Davis in November of last year, the governors and our premier announced their interest in coast-wide efforts to promote product stewardship, which includes the reduction of product materials that contribute to marine debris. There are many things that we have in common as peoples. There are some things, of course, that we have as difference. It was best captured for me, and those of you that may have watched the gold medal hockey game in the Winter Olympics that we hosted a bit more than 12 months ago, and after the game was over, the American fans, of course, were disappointed, and the Canadian fans were disappointed because they were worried that the American fans were sad. And that kind of characterizes the way we come at problems sometimes. You're here evaluating choices, and I'm reminded of that great philosopher, Yogi Berra, who says, when you come to a fork in the road, take one. I'm hoping that we might be able to further inform your choices as you listen through the testimony that you're going to hear this afternoon. I hope to reveal an experience with EPR that can be demonstrated to be good for the economy while being good for the environment in both my province, which has been the case, and in your state. Encore Pacific, of which I'm involved, is a industry stewardship corporation, a not-for-profit stewardship corporation. We manage the beverage container system and the electronic collection system for British Columbia. My board is made up of major producers and retailers. My observations in this question this afternoon have been distilled out of 45 years in the business community, the last 15 of which have been in the stewardship business. I'd like to describe, if I could, a few of the winning elements. What I intend to do is talk about key choices for government. I intend to talk about the economic and environmental outcomes that we've observed in British Columbia. I'll talk about the evolution of how we started in 1994 and where we are now. And finally, the lessons that we've learned that may partially inform some of the key decisions that you as a government will make here in Sacramento. The first key policy choice is to hold industry responsible for physical and financial obligations in the end-of-life management of consumer products and packaging. Secondly, government should regulate with a focus on results and ensuring compliance and a level playing field for producers. However, they should neither operate stewardship programs nor prescribe in statute the methods to be employed by industry who they have charged with the duty to perform. Admittedly, this takes courage and discipline. The results are worth it. This has been the British Columbia experience. So what are the results? Keep in mind that the California economy is 10 times the size of British Columbia, so you'll have to do the metrics yourself. On the job front, these stewardship programs to date have created 2,100 full-time jobs in British Columbia. My own company has created just over 1,200 full-time jobs. There have not been any disruptions to our economy, nor for companies affected by these programs. On the environmental side, the diversion of materials away from landfill into the resource recovery economy has annually reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 600,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents, which is the equivalent of taking 73,000 cars off the road, conserving 860,000 barrels of oil, and 40 million gallons of gasoline. We are pleased with these results for our province. Your potential is clearly significant in California. How did we do it? It has been a journey that started almost 20 years ago with the government initially operating recovery programs for scrap tires and automotive lead-acid batteries. It started with the government deciding to take the initiative. They financed it through the sales tax system. They recognized there were a wide range of other materials that they needed to deal with, and they were encouraged to do so by local governments who were facing cost pressures. But of course, they were also faced with significant pressures to downsize and to reduce the size of government. The second Yogi Berra saying is deja vu all over again. Coincidentally, in the mid-90s in Western Europe, laws were emerging that shifted the financial responsibility away from government to producers and consumers. In addition to relieving local governments of the burden of costs, the goal was to engage producers in end-of-life management, to incentivize them to embrace sustainable design and production, and to use their market expertise to elevate environmental performance. It became known as EPR. This was a game changer in British Columbia. From 1994 to 1998, the government enlisted through regulation industry to set up stewardship programs for used oil, unused pharmaceuticals, leftover paint, and a wide range of residual household hazardous wastes. The final crossword on our journey was the introduction in 2004 of a true framework approach. Incidentally, the game changer took place under what we would consider to be, or in your lexicon, a democratic government. The change that occurred in 2004 was under, in your lexicon, what would have been a Republican government. This was not an ideological discussion in British Columbia at all. Here's why they went with the framework approach finally in 2004. Industry was being required to accept end-of-life management for a wide range of consumer products. And they wanted, as a quid pro quo, to reduce the amount of prescription that had crept into the individual separate regulations because they were all done separately. There was a tire regulation, there was a battery regulation, there was a used oil regulation, there was a pharmaceutical regulation, and on and on and on. We'd had enough experience to know that we should move to a different style of regulation. Other industry sectors that were going to be obligated in the future wanted to have certainty. And they couldn't get it, of course, from the prescriptive individual product stream regulation. Well, government officials could also see that their oversight duties as a regulator were quite onerous when regulations were prescriptive, because they had to intervene often and make decisions on the marketplace. And secondly, they often had to adjudicate business-to-business conflicts, neither of which they felt was an appropriate role as a regulator, nor necessarily one for which they were equipped. Today, the British Columbia government employs 6 full-time staff who oversee all of the product stewardship programs that we have in British Columbia. And local government, now relieved of this responsibility, enjoys significant savings in direct costs and in landfill costs. An information package, I believe, was distributed to you earlier that had the BC Recycling Handbook. All the programs in that handbook are industry-operated programs, and I think it listed 8 or 9. Since we published that last year, it was put out by the industry. New programs for fluorescent lighting, thermostats, and small appliances have been approved. 3 more programs in the last 12 months. Packaging and printed paper is scheduled to be regulated in an EPR program in British Columbia within the very near future. Would we go back to government-operated programs? No, we would not. Industry likes it the way it is. Environmental groups are satisfied that industry is performing. Governments at both the senior and local level envisage the day when all consumer products and packaging are managed by industry through an EPR program, and local governments essentially handle only organics such as food waste. All other materials in the waste stream are handled under EPR programs. We're probably 3 to 4 years away from achieving that circumstance in British Columbia. In conclusion, here's what I think we've discovered I don't classify it as knowledge. It's more really an accumulation of experience from the twists and the turns and over 15 years of working on this. To minimize economic distortions, which are crucial, to minimize those distortions, to optimize job creation and reduce the burden on local taxpayers, allow industry to design, finance, and operate regulated stewardship programs, not voluntary, for consumer products and packaging. To achieve continuously improving environmental outcomes, require industry to provide verifiable and transparent reporting of sales. And thirdly, to enlist broad support, consult widely in advance of implementing industry-led stewardship programs. Typically in British Columbia, from the time a legislative authority says that we're going to move in a particular sector, they typically provide a 3-year period in which active consultation is to occur between the producers and all the affected stakeholders. EPR is an alternative regulatory system that works. Initiated under a well-designed framework approach, and I think I need to underline, not all framework works. The framework, I think, that subscribes to some of the key principles that I know were in some of the initiatives by Chairman Chesborough. It's doing it the right way that makes EPR work. Hopefully, I've outlined some of the things that, from our experience, has worked well in British Columbia. Under a well-designed framework approach, industry will, in my experience, in my opinion, accept its responsibility and produce economic and environmental results for your citizens. The companies that are involved in British Columbia, if you looked at the nameplates, the same companies as are involved in California are the North American economy, and the consumer products and packaging side is pretty integrated. We may have a few companies that you don't see, and you would have a few companies that we don't see. But essentially, these are the same companies and the same retailers that you would be involved with here in the state of California. So I conclude by always posing the rhetorical question, and maybe it's on the minds of some of you, in terms of moving forward with framework for the state of California. If not now, when? If not you, who? Thank you.
Thank you. One question. When you set up this framework, do you require separate legal authority for each product that comes in?
Yes, the government, actually it's the cabinet.
That's us
here. The government would, for example, set down, I give you the example of we've just introducing the electronic collection program for small appliances. So the government would pass a regulation that says these are the items that are going to be covered by this regulation, and that's the primary thing that they do. They give the definitions as to what products will be covered so that the producers know who now is obligated under the new regulation. So that's one of the key signal and trigger from the legislative authority.
May I, Mr. Chairman, along the same lines, he asked the question I was going to ask in a slightly different way, but so that's the who, but is it a regulatory or a legislative matter, and is there any criteria for determining which products to prioritize?
Yes, there is. There is a. Well, firstly, it is a. We have an overarching piece of legislation called the Environmental Management Act, and then we have something called the Recycling Regulation. And the way it works is that the cabinet of the day, acting on behalf, it's the Executive Committee of Government, says we're going to add this to the regulation. So they don't change the overarching regulation.
It's a regulatory process.
It is.
That's authorized by the legislative framework?
That's exactly right.
Okay. And were you through with that question, Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead, Mr.
What about packaging, and where's packaging fall in the prioritization, and what do you envision happening with that? Because that's you mentioned marine pollution, and that, those issues continue to pop up in our process as high priority for the public.
We will have that regulation within a year. It will cover all packaging, including transport packaging. It will obligate packaging from all sources, both residential, industrial, commercial, and institutional, and that will be regulated within the year. It was ready to go, and then we had a semi-change of government when our premier resigned. So that created a certain amount of inertia, but it's ready to go, and it will go.
Okay, my final comment would just be in relation to your comment of who serves on your board. It seems important that we not just have the policymakers talking to each other, but maybe the representatives of the same companies who are working in British Columbia and the representatives of the companies who are working here to talk to each other about consistent policy across international borders. If it's working in one place, then we have to try to figure out how to make it, what the obstacles are to making it work elsewhere.
I think I'd largely sign on to that notion, although I do make the obvious caution is British Columbia is a small economy. You're not. We do not have a very large manufacturing base, and you do. I think, however, there's upside to that. The job gains that I described are largely in service jobs because we don't have a big manufacturing base for all the materials we collected. We ship a lot of those materials to the United States. But I think the state of California's economic structure is somewhat more robust than is the British Columbia one.
Vice Chair Knight.
Yes, thank you very much for your testimony. You really perplexed this board up here when you said 6 people on the administration and they handle this whole process. Yes. And so California is about 10 times the population. We could do that with 60?
If you did framework the way we've done it, there's different ways of doing it, but the way this government chose to do it was effectively to act as a regulator, to ensure compliance and ensure enforcement, but not to get involved in operational details. So what they have are staff who, in fact, oversee the stewardship companies, of which we now have 15 stewardship companies. And so they're overseeing those companies like mine. But it's my job to meet the standards of the regulation, to report publicly and transparently, and to achieve continuous improvement. So it's a shift in terms of the role for government, but it's one that they are quite comfortable with, and hence it's a pretty small footprint in terms of staff costs.
And doing it efficiently.
And the environmental outcomes, I won't get into all that, but the environmental outcomes in terms of our performance are quite good, quite exceptional.
Assemblymember Grove.
Thank you very much. And also, you piqued my curiosity, and I have some questions I'd like to ask you. When you said government shared, the government should regulate a level playing field. So I have a list. I contacted one of my recycling vendors, and I said, what regulatory agencies all encompass do you report to or answer to? So I realize that these are California or federal, but if there is an equivalent to Vancouver or British Columbia's, I'd like to ask you if you're under any of these so-called agencies in a Canadian form versus an American form, like Cal EPA, Federal EPA, Cal OSHA, Fed OSHA, the Police Department, Fire Department, California Highway Patrol, U.S. Department of Transportation, California Air Resources Board, South Coast Air Quality Management Board, Census Bureau, U.S. Department of Commerce, Internal Revenue Service, Franchise Tax Board, National Labor Relations Board, Federal Maritime Commission, State Board of Equalization, Homeland Security, City Business License, City Planning Departments, Division of Recycling, California Integrated Waste Management Board, Local Solid Waste Environmental Enforcement Agency, State Office of Weights and Measures, County Office of Weights and Measures, Pier Pass Authority for Local, State Water Resources Control Board, Federal Water Resources Control Board, Regional Water Resources Control Board, U.S. Department of Labor, Department of Labor Standards Enforcement, Department of Fair Employment and Housing, Industrial Relations Board, California Labor Commission, Department of Toxic Substance Organization, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, Department of Transportation, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Department of Justice, Department of Motor Vehicles, Port of Los Angeles, Port of Long Beach. Are you guys under like the same regulatory reporting that we are? Just a question.
Probably the answer is yes.
Really?
The names are different.
Okay.
The split between what's federal and what's state is somewhat different because our constitutions are different. But if I look at, we're an operating country. We actually move tons around. We collect things. We operate. We're covered by many of those same kinds of requirements. If we go and open up a collection depot and there's a difficulty with vagrants, guess who I end up dealing with? The police force.
Right.
If we have illegal exports of consumer electronics going to Asia, guess who I end up dealing with? customs and immigration. So I don't think there's a significant difference that way. The difference that I was describing, though, which I think is specific, is that when it comes to administering the stewardship programs, the pure administration of these stewardship programs, we don't have middle agencies. I have to report directly into the government of British Columbia. I don't go through an intermediary agency. They've chosen not to do that. Some other provinces in Canada have done that, though. They have intermediate agencies.
But you guys have done it really efficiently.
Well, there's always a debate about it. I think it's an approach that has worked. I think it has these fundamental underpinnings to it that have to be put in place, because without them, I don't believe the British Columbia approach would work. I know producers, manufacturers would not support it if it meant that the government was prescribing how to go and get the job done. They would not support it at all. They support it because they're charged with the responsibility and given the autonomy to make the best results possible. And that's the quid pro quo between the government and the manufacturer.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Assemblymember Morale.
I think you answered a lot of my questions, but one last one. What is the unemployment rate in British Columbia right now?
It's about 7.5%. I think we were at about 8.5%, and we've been improving it modestly.
Assemblymember Dickinson, please.
Good afternoon, and thank you for being here and for the materials you've provided. My question is, as you have more and more gotten into extended producer responsibility, whether you have seen any change in the amount of packaging that occurs. We seem to have lots and lots of layers of packaging that, to many consumers, seems quite wasteful of materials. I'm just curious about whether extended producer responsibility has encompassed the idea that packaging could be leaner.
It hasn't in British Columbia. We're too small a market. To a large extent, the major multinationals are designing world packaging or world scale packaging. If you talk to colleagues of mine in the European Union, it's 450 million market size, they can demonstrate to you actual per capita reductions in the amount of packaging being placed on the market at the same time as GDP was rising. But that's because they have scale. Scale is really significant. I think that's be a big difference between California and British Columbia. We just don't have the scale to make that impact for producers.
Do you know whether or not they have quantified any savings associated with reducing the amount of packaging or processing costs if they're paying for producing the waste stream? Presumably they would have some savings also at the tail end as well as the front end?
Yes, they have quantified them. They've done. I don't have the data, but that data is available. I know the California Product Stewardship Council has that data available to them.
Okay, good. Oh, great. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Hasty, for coming down here. And that's our look at our first alternative regulatory system. Thank you very much.